Hey, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co, and today we're going to be talking about Nightshift. Now, you may or may not already know about this game, and, well, let me start off with a few disclaimers to kind of give you an idea of what this video is and isn't about. I will not be showing this game right now. I will not be covering, reviewing the game. I will not be talking about the Kickstarter campaign. You will not see any aspect of the game on camera. So if you already know about this game and you're like, how dare you? Well, I mean, that's going to be a starting baseline. This is a conversation more around the nature of the game, its place in the board game space, why it's not really being covered, why I chose not to cover it, where I think there are some double standards, when and where does that matter. I'm going to get into a bunch of those things, but you might already be unhappy that I'm talking about it all, or you might be very happy that I'm talking about this. Frankly, I don't know. I don't know what your personal goals are, but I hope to try to talk about it respectfully and try to cover things the way I see them. And again, maybe this video is for you, maybe not. But with that, let's go ahead and dive into some background for those who don't already know about the game. It's currently trending the #1 game on the BGG hotness because it has been getting a lot of buzz, a lot of conversation. What is this game? Who's it for? Is it a good game? Any and all of that. And Nightshift is basically a game based around adult entertainers. It is based on exotic dancers trying to part their audience with their money. It's created by, I believe the name is Exotic Cancer. I think she does various Instagram art, if I'm not mistaken. She is a former dancer, and she decided to create this game in a theme that isn't usually seen, a very risque theme, adult theme that isn't usually seen in the board game space. We have so many themes about tons of different games that, hey, this is just another theme. Or is it, which is part of the conversation here. And I'm going to start with why I'm personally not covering it. Full disclaimer, she reached out to me, she asked me to cover the game. I did flip through the rulebook to try to see if I think it's the right game for my audience, just for mechanics alone. Forget the theme, do I think mechanics alone put it as the right game? And frankly, I do think it's on the lighter side. I don't think it's necessarily a bad game, I haven't played it, this is judged purely from the rulebook, but it definitely does look like a game that's on the lighter side, but I have definitely covered lighter games before, and I don't think the mechanics alone would push me away from the game. For me, what did have me pause or hesitant is to start with my own personal aversion to the theme. I don't have an interest in playing that game. I don't have an interest in having that game on the table. Generally, though, I would say that there are other games where I've looked past that. World War II, I've said many, many times, I don't like World War II on my table. I don't need that. I'm not pulled in by that theme. But if the mechanics are good enough, I'll look past that. I don't think I want to with Nightshift, so I'm starting off with a personal aversion to the theme where I don't like it. But I also try to look past that. I thought past the fact that there is a consideration, or I have in consideration, to the inconsistent approach to adult topics in, well, any space, but right now in the board game space, there's an inconsistent value approach to which adult topics are allowed. You can have games about violence left, right, and center, and nobody blinks an eye. Heck, you have Letters from Whitechapel, where you're literally murdering, literally the entire plot of it is Jack the Ripper murdering people, and then one of the players is playing as Jack the Ripper, and that's, maybe loosely frustrating to some people, but everyone kind of accepts it. It is what it is. And then you have something like this, where you have adult content, and that is suddenly the bridge too far, it pushes people away, and that is an inconsistent value approach. And so I wondered for myself, should I be looking past my own personal biases to cover this for my channel? And I did think through very heavily about this because it's a hard conversation. I have my own personal stance, but should I look past that? Should I look past my Western biases? I don't know if it's Western biases, if it's America. I'm Canadian, so I guess more North America. I don't know exactly which biases are at play, and I don't know how widely this opinion is held depending on which continent you're from. What I do know is with my Western biases, I definitely have an aversion to that as something that I would personally play. And the reason that I decided not to cover the game is frankly a consideration of you. A consideration of, and again, you is relative. It might not be you, it might be the other you watching this video. A consideration of my audience and their preferences. The fact that my audience is mostly American and that their preferences and biases likely will align with mine. And whether those preferences and biases are consistent across the realm of adult types of content that can be present, from anything from violence to who knows what, whether those are consistent or not, I still have the preference to not throw something on the screen that you would consider, again, you as relative here, but that someone watching this video would not expect to see. Frankly, it's the kind of thing that, whether something's okay or not, by choosing to watch this channel, I want to deliver the types of content that you're used to. I don't want to surprise you with things that are out of the blue. And that could be anything from not swearing every 2 seconds. I mean, like, if you ever watched some of the live streams with, like, Devin or Meg, I try to keep the swearing down to an absolute minimum because If one slips out across an entire stream, I'm kind of okay with it. But even that, there's an argument made not to. If you're watching my videos with kids in the background because you can safely have a Board Game Co. video on because you've decided that you don't want swearing in your household, for me to suddenly start swearing on camera or to allow swearing on camera can be something that frustrates you, and that's a reasonable assumption. To a certain extent, the kinds of content you create, you should try to do what you can to not shock your viewers into a situation where they get something that they weren't looking for. And there was very strongly that consideration, that while I have my own biases and preferences, I can get over those if I think it's the right thing to do, but I don't want to throw things off for the sake of someone who didn't sign up for that. And that was my own decision or judgment call. And even then, like something with to back or not to back, I debated putting it at the very end of the video and like give you a warning, hey, we're about to dive into this. But even something like that, I thought it might do almost more damage to kind of hide it in the back corner of the video rather than not talking about it at all. That's kind of my own stance. And I say this because I believe Exotic Cancer has reached out to over 50 reviewers and like 2 people are covering the game. Most people decline to cover the game because most reviewers, for whatever their own reasons are, I can't speak for their reasons, I can speak for my own. That's kind of why I'm not covering it. But is it fair? Is this a fair approach? Because I have 2 general thoughts about the conversation, and one is the consistency to other hard topics, and 2 is whether it's right or wrong in its own right, in its own aspect, standing on its own. Is it okay to not want a certain type of content? And then separately, is it consistent to other types of content? And to deal with those, I'll start by saying I don't think it's a consistent value system. I don't. And that's the part that makes me struggle with this a bit, because I do think it's okay to have your own preferences, whether your preferences, my preferences. I think it's okay for anyone to have a type of content that they don't enjoy. Whether that's something that just comes down to an opinion, I'm done with Marvel, whether it comes down to certain types of things, I don't like violence in games, I don't like a game that has stealing. I know people who won't play games like Resistance or One Night Ultimate Werewolf because it involves lying and they don't want to teach their children to lie as part of a game construct. Whatever your own sensitivities are, I do think that's fair to have your own sensitivities. There is a harder conversation about, is there any line that's not okay? Are you allowed to be, like, what's that line? I'm trying to think how to say this comfortably, but let's put this in the most, I guess, offensive way possible. If you sat there and said, well, I don't like having women in my game at all. I just don't want women in my game. Or I don't want insert skin color, ethnicity, religion in my game. I think that you start to cross some lines where a preference to not have something in the game you're playing is really offensive and problematic. I don't think we're talking about that with any of the conversations or any of the topics on the table right now. But in terms of consistency to other topics, I think it's inconsistent. I think it's unfair. There are so many games that have survived for so long. Some of them are topics that we're dabbling into the first time. Things like, colonization is something like, that there's finally a larger degree of sensitivity around games with colonization. But violence is acceptable left, right, and center. And those 2 things also come up hand in hand, by the way. The idea, people sit there and say, oh, well, there's colonization in games. Well, you're murdering people here and you're okay with that. And I think it's okay to have sensitivities. I think it's okay to be sensitive to the topic of colonization while not being sensitive to violence. I think you can sit there and say, is this something that is personally offensive to me? And is that thing, again, trying to exclude gender, race, religion, all of those things, different conversations. I think that's a whole different level. But for the most part, I think these are reasonable conversations around which hard topic are you okay having at your table? What simulation are you okay having at your table? And I think we'll all have different degrees of reality that we impart to those different topics. And to be very clear, and I'm going to say this a few times in this video, I'm not comparing a board game about adult dancers to colonization or murder. I'm not in any way equating any of those things in any way, shape, or form. The only thing I'm equating is the idea that we all have certain topics that we don't feel the need to see represented at our table when we're playing a game. For some people, it might be. Again, for me, I don't like World War II themed games. Not specifically World War II. It could be World War I, World War II. I don't mind knights and stuff like that. You want to throw knights, you want to throw space combat. If you abstract it enough so that it's removed from reality for me, sure. And the Middle Ages did happen. It's reality, but it's so far removed from my concept of reality that marching a bunch of knights around the table does work. Marching around a bunch of space marines around a table does work. But once you throw actual real warfare on the table, it just takes the fun out of it for me. It doesn't mean that the game can't be fun, but I do enjoy those games less because it's a little too real. It's a little too real for me. I just don't need that simulation of warfare for me. But everyone's allowed to have their own line in the sand. But it's definitely inconsistent. It's definitely inconsistent that you can have a Jack the Ripper style board game and call that okay, but then look at something that has a bit of adult content and say that this is the line that's too far. So I do think it's very strongly inconsistent. but I do think there is an element of closer to home, a closer to home feeling that impacts these topics. That's why I think for some people you'll find colonization-based topics closer to home. For some people it might be real warfare versus abstracted or historical or space warfare. Historical or future warfare versus real warfare might be closer to home. The idea of dealing with a strip club as a theme for a board game might be closer to home. It is easier mentally to say, yeah, of course we're dealing with this giant war game where we're murdering each other the entire time, where we're killing each other and praying to gods and casting down lightning bolts and getting cool powers, because nothing about that feels real. So even while there is a degree of inconsistency at play, I still think that we have to mentally take into account that closer to home concept that might make something more distasteful than something else. So it's inconsistent with a caveat is the way I'd put it. I think that's the way I'd kind of close that off. But then there's a separate conversation about, is it right or wrong in its own right? Are you okay to have preferences around which things just don't work for you? Is there an element of adult content present in this game that might be, because again, even if we say it's inconsistent, even if we sit there and say completely and totally it's inconsistent, just because one harsh topic has become allowed and real and no one cares, does that mean we should introduce all harsh topics and say, well, this got away with it, so we should put all of these into the mix? And I don't think we should. Whether you're comparing colonization to violent games, whether you're comparing Nightshift to violent games, I don't think that inherently the bar should be, well, this doesn't bother people, so this shouldn't bother people. I think you can evaluate on its own merits in its own right. And I do think there's an element of Nightshift that I think that there are, again, it is going to be a cultural thing, but I think there are sensitivities around what's okay. Those sensitivities do apply to video games. They apply to movies. They're all over the place. It's the idea of what are we okay with as a culture, and each culture is going to examine those things differently. I saw a comment regarding Nightshift that really resonated with me, where someone said, I don't have a problem with the idea that this game exists. More power to you. But I can't imagine ever wanting to sit down. The types of people who are playing that game, I can't imagine ever walking into a convention, walking into a game store, seeing people playing Nightshift, and feeling like that's the table that I want to sit down at. Like, I want to go ahead and sit down and play a game about exotic dancers. And that comment resonated with me, because I agree with that. And again, even with those inconsistencies, even though the idea that we can sit there and cast flaming fireballs at each other and do who knows what, but this is the game that's the line in the sand, but nonetheless, there's a practical reality of who's going to play that game, and do you see yourself at the table? I think pushing boundaries can be a good thing, and can result in great social change, genuinely. I think the fact that this game exists is pushing boundaries. I think the fact that this game exists is going to start conversations about what's okay. And it also might change what's acceptable or not acceptable. And the inherent part of this that's hard to process is pushing boundaries is the only way that change exists. Sometimes you push boundaries and the boundaries push back, and those things don't exist. Sometimes you push boundaries and you end up with, I don't know, the abolition of slavery, more women's rights, the right, women's suffrage and the right to vote. And again, I am not comparing Nightshift to those things. It's not at all what's happening here. But the idea that the only way you ever have change is by starting hard conversations, is by making people feel uncomfortable about something that was the norm and is comfortable. And I think in many of those cases, we can look back and say, well, clearly what we have now is better. Clearly the fact that we started these conversations and we pushed for social change is better. But I think there are many times where it won't be better. And I don't know the answer there. I don't know the answer. I 100% have a Western sensitivity towards certain types of adult content while being totally okay with violence and swear words. You throw violence and swear words into movies, whatever. My swear words, language I'm a little more sensitive to. Violence I couldn't care less at all. My kids want to watch some horror monster being ripped apart from limb to limb and blood going everywhere. As long as they don't have nightmares about it, I don't care. Violence I'm a little more sensitive. They need to be a little older. And then suddenly you throw nudity in, oh, well, they got to be a whole lot older. I have that sensitivity. I absolutely do. Is it normal? Is it okay? I don't know those things. And so the fact that a game exists that can push boundaries, the fact that the game exists that can start a conversation, I think that's reasonable. But I think it's also interesting that most people chose not to cover this game. I think most reviewers sat there and said, we think either ourselves, as the reviewer, or our audience, because it's either one of those two they think had a sensitivity here. And that's why I think Nightshift wasn't covered by nearly anyone in this industry. And I don't know where that leaves things. I don't really know, where does that leave Nightshift? And I don't really know, but it does make me think of Prison Architect. I don't know if you remember Prison Architect, but it was a game, I can't remember the cover. Was it Board and Dice? I don't remember. But it was a board game version of the video game, a simulation of running a prison, and it didn't do well. It didn't do well at all. And I don't know if that was the game's appeal on its own right. I don't know if it was about the fact that it was about running a prison, which many people did not like. Despite working in the video game industry and being very popular, many board gamers did not like the idea of running a prison for profit as a simulation. That was something that didn't work for them. And the campaign didn't do well. The game didn't find its audience. What I find fascinating about Nightshift is Nightshift at $400,000 raised, at 3,500 backers by the time of filming this video, Nightshift clearly found its audience. It managed to find a large audience of people who are very interested in the game. What's interesting is that the reviewers said no. All the people who were asked to cover the game said no. And I don't know what the takeaway there is. I don't know who the audience is that's backing Nightshift. I don't know if it's people in the board game space. I don't know if it's Exotic Cancer's own following. I don't know if it's separate to the video game, separate to the board game space, the people who are dabbling in board games. There's a whole world of people out there, and 3,500 people, as large a number as it can be, I don't know who those 3,500 people are. I don't know if the reviewers were too sensitive and misread their audience, or if it's the reviewers' own sensitivities at play and the audience doesn't matter at all. They just want to say no. I don't know the answers there. I am curious, but I don't know. And that's why, if you've been following the channel, there's a video series I like to do where I ask a bunch of random questions. The next random question series is going to be about Nightshift and other hard topics or adult conversations, topics, whatever it is. It specifically will be a polling of how many of you back Nightshift? What types of topics do you care about or don't care about? Do you think these topics should exist or they simply don't bother you? It's going to be a bunch of questions around things like that because I'm fascinated. For my own sake, I guess I want to know, is this really my own sensitivity at play that I'm projecting unfairly on my audience, on you? Or is it a real, genuine sensitivity? I know that in one video I covered upcoming crowdfunding campaigns and I said Nightshift is going to be one of them. And I had a few people who are upset at me for even saying that, for even briefly giving it 10 seconds of coverage that this game even exists. There were some people who are upset. But 2 or 3 people who are upset at me does not equal my audience. I never do anything based off of 2 or 3 people in the audience. I do care what the overall audience thinks about, prefers, wants, and also there's just my own curiosity around what sensitivities are at play or aren't at play in the board game space. I think Nightshift is fascinating. I like things that start conversations. I have my own personal aversion to it, but I don't know if it's a fair aversion or just one that I have because I grew up in Canada, moved to America, and spent my entire life here. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. It's an interesting topic today. I look forward to the poll. And until next time, I hope you have a good one.